Have you ever walked past something small, something others overlooked, and felt like it mattered more than it seemed? Like a photo tucked in a drawer, or an old key with no lock. Sometimes, it's the quietest objects that carry the loudest stories. And this one, it began on an ordinary afternoon, in a place most people would never think to look. It was a cloudy Thursday when Emily stepped into the little pawn shop on the corner of Maple and Fifth. Her mother was inside looking for a replacement lamp, but Emily wasn't really paying attention to that. She wandered through aisles of rusted tools, old records, a guitar missing 2 strings. The kind of forgotten things that made you wonder who once held them, and why they were let go. Then she saw it. A small glint of metal, almost hidden behind a chipped vase and a stack of dusty paperback books. It wasn't flashy. In fact, it looked like it hadn't been touched in years. But something about it, its quiet presence, made her stop. She reached out, gently picked it up. A medal. Military, she thought, though she wasn't sure. It felt heavier than it looked. Not in weight, but in feeling. Like it had waited a long time for someone to notice. She turned to show her mom, but something stopped her. There was a name etched on the back. Just a name. No date, no rank. Just a name she didn't recognize, yet. Emily didn't know it then, but picking up that medal would become more than a curious moment in a dusty shop. It would become a doorway, into a story that had been left behind. The bell above the pawn shop door gave a tired little jingle as it closed behind Emily. The place had that faint, metallic smell of forgotten years, old coins, aging metal, dust, and time. Her mother was a few feet away, browsing a shelf of kitchenware. Emily stood near the counter, medal still in hand, as the man behind it slowly looked up. He was in his early 70s, with thinning gray hair and thick glasses that slid down his nose. His name tag, faded and crooked, read Larry. He didn't speak right away. His eyes landed on the medal, and something shifted in his face, like a shadow passing behind his expression. "Where'd you find that?" he asked, voice low and a little rough. Emily pointed. "Over there." It was just, sitting. Larry nodded, but it was the kind of nod that didn't mean much. He reached for the medal slowly, as if touching it might bring back something he'd rather forget. He held it for a moment, turned it over in his hand, then gave it back without a word. "Do you know who it belonged to?" Emily asked. He hesitated. "Came in years ago. I don't remember who brought it. People bring all kinds of things. Some they sell. Some they leave behind. But it has a name on it," Emily said quietly. "It looks important." Larry rubbed the bridge of his nose, like the conversation was pulling him somewhere he didn't want to go. "Yeah, it probably was. To someone. But that was a long time ago." There was no anger in his voice. Just a kind of tiredness. Like he'd seen too many things come and go, too many names lost in the shuffle of years. Maybe he had known the story behind the medal once. Maybe he chose not to remember. Emily didn't press. She just held the medal a little tighter, as if it had started to mean something already. Something she couldn't explain, but couldn't ignore. Back home, Emily sat cross-legged at the kitchen table, the medal laid gently in front of her. Her fingers traced the edges, over the small ridges, the engraved eagle, the tiny stars pressed into the metal. But it was the back that kept drawing her eyes, the name. Sergeant Harold Whitmore. She whispered it aloud, as if saying it might make it more real. It sounded serious. It sounded like someone who mattered. Her mother leaned over her shoulder, holding a mug of tea. "You really want to know who he was?" she asked. Emily nodded without looking up. "I think he deserves it." That night, they sat together at the computer, a quiet rhythm of clicking keys and scrolling screens filling the room. They tried the usual search engines. Nothing specific came up, just scattered mentions in old public record indexes. A few Harold Whitmores across different states, some obituaries, a few mentions in archived news articles. But none of them seemed to line up. No reference to military service. No mention of a missing medal. They narrowed the search. Military records. War archives. The name finally appeared, just once. A Sergeant Harold Whitmore, listed under a U.S. Army infantry unit deployed to Vietnam in 1970. Status, missing in action, presumed deceased. That was it. No photo. No family listed. No grave. Emily leaned back in her chair, shoulders slumping slightly. It's like he disappeared. Her mother sighed. A lot of them did. And not all of them came back the way they left. But someone gave him this, Emily said, pointing to the medal. Someone honored him. It had to mean something to someone. There was a long pause between them. Her mother gave her a soft look. It meant something to you. Emily didn't answer. She just stared at the name, her young face caught in a quiet stillness that felt older than her years. Later that week, she brought the medal to school. Showed it to her history teacher, Mr. Dalton, a quiet man with silver hair and a limp he never talked about. He took the medal in his hand, turned it gently, and nodded. This is a bronze star, he said, almost to himself. This wasn't given lightly. Emily watched his eyes shift when he read the name. There was something familiar in his silence. Not knowledge, exactly, but reverence. Would there be any way to find out more, she asked. He looked up at her with a half-smile. Maybe. But it might take time. I have time, she replied. And in that moment, something settled between them. A quiet agreement. She wasn't doing this for a school project. She was doing it for him, for a name etched in silver. For a man no one seemed to remember. At least, not yet. Mr. Dalton kept his promise. By the following week, he had reached out to a veteran support group in the next county, retired soldiers who had built an informal network for cases like this, quiet stories that had slipped through the cracks of time. One of the volunteers there, a man named Jack McKinley, said the name sounded familiar. He offered to meet with Emily and her mother at the local American Legion Hall. It was a gray Saturday when they arrived. The air smelled faintly of rain, and the wooden sign out front creaked in the breeze. Inside, the room was filled with flags, old photographs, and a bulletin board cluttered with yellowing newspaper clippings. It was quiet, almost like a chapel. Jack stood near the back. He was tall, maybe in his late 60s, with sun-weathered skin and the calm stillness of someone who had seen more than he cared to explain. He shook Emily's hand and looked her straight in the eye. You found something that doesn't usually find its way back, he said. That takes more heart than most people realize. Emily handed him the medal. Jack turned it over slowly. When he read the name, his eyebrows lifted just a little. Harold Whitmore, he said, almost under his breath. Yeah. I remember hearing that name. Not personally. But there was a file. Years ago. He reached into a faded canvas bag and pulled out a binder, thick with plastic sleeves. Inside were handwritten notes, copied documents, photos, and lists of names. He turned page after page with quiet hands until he found a section marked MIA, 1970 to 1972. There, he pointed. Harold Whitmore. Army. Bronze Star. Last known unit, 2nd Battalion, 8th Infantry. Went missing near Quang Tri, Vietnam. No confirmed death. No recovery. Just, gone. Emily leaned in closer. Did he have any family? Jack nodded slowly. There's a note here. Younger brother, Thomas Whitmore. Born 1951. At the time of Harold's deployment, Thomas would have been 19. Do you know where he is now? Emily asked. Jack hesitated. Last known address was in Fairfield. But that was over 20 years ago. Emily's mother pulled out her phone, typed quietly, then showed them the screen. There's a Thomas Whitmore in a nursing home in Fairfield. St. Mary's Care Facility. It's less than an hour from here. No one spoke for a moment. The weight of the medal felt heavier than ever now. It wasn't just an object. It was a thread, thin but unbroken, leading back to someone who had waited in silence. They made the drive that afternoon. The nursing home sat on a quiet stretch of road, tucked behind tall oaks. The receptionist confirmed that Thomas was there and agreed to bring them to the common room, where he usually sat by the window. Thomas Whitmore was a small, thin man with neatly combed white hair and deep lines across his face. He wore a cardigan and corduroy pants. His hands rested gently on a folded blanket over his knees. He looked up when they approached, his eyes a faded blue. "Mr. Whitmore?" Emily said softly. I think this might have belonged to your brother." She held out the medal. For a long moment, Thomas didn't move. His gaze stayed fixed on the medal in her palm. Then his lips parted slightly. He blinked hard. And then, almost imperceptibly, his hand reached forward. He took the medal, fingers trembling, and turned it over. When he read the name, his shoulders gave way. Not dramatically. Just enough to let the air escape from years of holding something in. "I thought it was lost," he whispered. "All of it. I thought no one remembered him." Emily didn't know what to say. So she said nothing. She simply stood beside him, and let the silence say what words couldn't. In that quiet, Harold Whitmore finally came home. Not in body, but in memory. And sometimes, that's where it matters most. Thomas invited them to his room. It was small, like most rooms in care facilities, neatly kept, with a single window that looked out over a quiet courtyard. On the dresser sat a framed photo of two boys, taken decades ago. You could tell which one was Harold. He had the same calm eyes Emily had imagined, the quiet strength. Thomas saw her looking at it and nodded. "That's the only picture I still have of him," he said. "Mom kept the others, but they were lost after she passed." He sat down slowly in his chair by the window and held the medal in both hands, as if it were something fragile. Emily and her mother sat nearby, not too close. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It felt respectful. Like even the air knew it shouldn't rush. Thomas cleared his throat. "I never got to say goodbye. He left one morning and told me to watch out for Mom. That was the last thing he said to me." He smiled, patted my shoulder, and walked out the door. He paused. "Back then, we didn't talk about things like we should have. I was just a kid, but I thought I'd see him again. That he'd come home and tell me stories. That we'd go fishing like we planned." Thomas ran his thumb along the edge of the medal, the engraved name catching the light. "They never told us much. Just a letter that he was missing. After a while, people stopped asking. Even I stopped talking about him. You learn to live around the silence, you know. It fills the space until you forget what it used to sound like when he was there." Emily's mother said softly, "Did he know he was getting this medal?" Thomas shook his head. "I don't think so. Nobody told us. I didn't even know it existed until now. I kept thinking maybe the army just forgot. Or maybe we weren't important enough." His voice cracked at the end, just a little. Emily stood up and crossed the room, then gently placed the medal in the center of the dresser, just below the photograph. It sat there, simple, quiet, proud. "Now it's home," she said. Thomas didn't respond right away. But then he looked up at her, eyes glassy but steady. "You brought back something I thought was lost forever," he said. "And not just this." The room fell silent again, but it wasn't the same silence as before. It was a silence filled with memory. And gratitude. And a kind of peace that doesn't come easy, but lasts a long, long time. A week later, Emily and her mother invited Thomas over for dinner. It took some convincing. Thomas had grown used to his routine, the quiet rhythms of the care facility, the familiar chair by the window. But something about the invitation felt different. It wasn't charity. It wasn't pity. It felt sincere. So, he said yes. Emily set the table carefully that evening, folding the napkins just right, making sure every plate was in its place. Her mother cooked pot roast, the kind that made the whole house smell like Sunday. And in the living room, above the fireplace, sat a small wooden frame. Inside it, the bronze star. It wasn't behind glass. There was no plaque. Just the metal, cradled in soft felt, resting at an angle where the light could catch its edges. When Thomas arrived, he paused at the doorway. His hands tightened around the arms of his wheelchair. He looked at the frame, then at Emily. "You didn't have to do that," he said quietly. "I know," Emily replied. "But I wanted to." They sat down together, the three of them. The meal was simple, but warm. Between bites, they talked, not about war, or loss, or medals. They talked about Harold's favorite music, about the time he tried to build a treehouse that collapsed halfway through, about how he loved root beer floats even in winter. Emily listened closely, smiling, asking questions. She wasn't just hearing about Harold, she was getting to know him. After dinner, Thomas wheeled himself closer to the mantel. He stared at the metal for a long time. His face didn't change much, but his shoulders seemed less heavy. "That," he said, nodding at the frame, "was always supposed to come home. I just didn't think I'd be around to see it." Emily sat on the carpet beside him. "Do you think he would have wanted people to remember?" Thomas didn't answer right away. Then, with a soft breath, he said, "I think he'd be surprised anyone still did." The room grew still. The only sound was the low hum of the heater and the quiet ticking of a wall clock. Emily's mother brought over a small candle and lit it, placing it gently next to the metal. The flame flickered, casting a soft glow across the bronze and the wood. It wasn't a ceremony. It wasn't planned. But in that moment, it felt like something sacred had taken shape. They didn't speak much after that. No one needed to. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It wasn't about forgetting. It was about remembering, together. As the night wore on and the sky turned a deep navy blue, Thomas looked down at Emily. "Thank you," he said, his voice just above a whisper. "You gave him a place again." Emily nodded, her eyes reflecting the candlelight. "He was never really gone. Just waiting." And the medal stayed there, on the mantelpiece. Not as a decoration. Not as a relic. But as a quiet witness to a story nearly lost, and the girl who chose not to let it disappear. The story might have ended there, with the medal resting quietly on the mantelpiece. But life has a way of carrying truth beyond the walls where it's first discovered. A few days after Thomas came for dinner, Emily's mother made a phone call to the local paper, the Fairfield Observer. It wasn't meant to be a headline. She just thought someone might want to know. Maybe it would be a small column, something to honor Harold's name. But the editor, a woman named Linda Beecham, listened closely. And by the end of the call, she asked if she could come meet them in person. The interview happened the next afternoon. Linda arrived with a notepad, a soft voice, and a way of asking questions that didn't feel like questions at all. She sat with Thomas, Emily, and her mother at the kitchen table. She didn't rush. She just listened. Thomas told his story carefully. Not everything. Just the parts he felt ready to share. About his brother. About the letter they received. About the silence that came after. And then about Emily, how a girl he'd never met walked into a pawn shop and brought back a piece of his life he thought had vanished. Linda asked to see the medal. Emily handed it to her, cradled in both hands. Linda took a photo, but didn't stage anything. She said the truth didn't need help looking dignified. The article ran the following Sunday, across 2 pages. The headline read, "A medal returned, a memory restored, the quiet journey of Sergeant Harold Whitmore." It included a photo of the medal on the mantel, and one of Thomas sitting beside it. The article didn't dramatize. It didn't need to. It simply told what happened, how a child followed a feeling, and how that small act led a forgotten name back into the light. By Tuesday, letters started arriving at the nursing home. Veterans who had served in Vietnam wrote to Thomas. Some remembered Harold's unit. A man named Richard Simmons sent a photo of his old platoon, and there, third from the right, was a young man with the same eyes as the boy in Thomas's photo frame. A local scout troop asked if they could visit Thomas and hear about Harold. The care facility agreed. They brought cards and a flag, and listened as Thomas, for the first time in decades, told someone younger than him about his brother. Even the mayor stopped by. Quietly. No camera. He just shook Thomas's hand and said, "Welcome home, Sergeant Whitmore." For Emily, it was strange at first, watching all of this ripple outward from one simple moment in a dusty shop. But she didn't feel overwhelmed. She felt right. Like something good had been set back in place. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the trees, Thomas called her. "I want you to have something," he said. She visited the next day. Thomas handed her a copy of the newspaper article, laminated and folded with care. On the back, he had written a note in neat cursive. For Emily, who saw what mattered when no one else did. She smiled, blinking hard. She didn't say much. Just sat with him a while as the sky turned golden. Sometimes, the truth doesn't arrive with noise. Sometimes, it moves like a whisper. But when it finally lands in the right hands, it echoes louder than any parade. The seasons began to shift. Leaves turned, wind cooled, and daylight softened just a little earlier each evening. The metal stayed on the mantel. Emily didn't touch it anymore. Not out of fear or distance, but respect. She passed it often, on her way to school, when setting the table, or curled on the couch reading in the evening light. It had become part of the room, like a silent heartbeat. One afternoon, she sat at the kitchen table with a pencil and a blank piece of paper. Her mother glanced over. "Writing something?" Emily nodded. Just trying to figure out how to say what it meant. Her mother smiled. "Sometimes you don't need to say everything. Sometimes just holding on to it is enough." Emily didn't answer, but her pencil kept moving. Across town, Thomas had taken to sitting near the window a little more than usual. He kept the article in a drawer, the cards from children stacked neatly in a small box. Every now and then, he'd pull out that photo of Harold and whisper something only he could hear. The story had spread far enough. Not wide, but deep. And for those who knew it, it lingered. Late one evening, Emily stood by the mantel again. Outside, the wind pushed softly at the windows. She looked up at the metal, then down at the small notebook in her hand. She opened it and read the last sentence she'd written. "The weight of a medal isn't in the metal. It's in what people choose to remember." She closed the notebook, placed it gently beside the frame, and walked away. The camera would have lingered there, just a little longer, on the soft light catching the bronze, on the quiet room behind her, on the stillness that spoke louder than anything else. And in that silence, Harold Whitmore stayed remembered. In a world that often celebrates noise, it was a quiet medal, found by a child in a dusty pawn shop, that reminded us what true remembrance looks like. Emily didn't set out to change lives. She simply followed a feeling, one quiet choice at a time. And through that gentle persistence, Sergeant Harold Whitmore's legacy came home, not with fanfare, but with dignity. The story reminds us that sometimes, the most important things we do aren't loud, they're consistent, kind, and quietly brave. Thomas didn't need a parade. He needed someone to care. And a forgotten name didn't need fame, it needed one person to remember. So maybe the question for each of us is this: what might we rediscover if we paused long enough to notice what others walk past? A photo. A memory. A name. A truth. If this story touched something in you, if it reminded you of someone who should never be forgotten, please consider liking this video, sharing it with someone you love, and subscribing to Legacy of Courage Stories. Because every quiet act of remembrance carries weight. And together, we can make sure no legacy is